Now we're moving it up a few generations to the Nintendo GameCube with the game Driven. Driven, based upon the same movie, which stars Sylvester Stallone as one of the characters, is also narrated in the game by Stallone. This is a racing game with cel-shaded style graphics. It's a pretty basic racing game, but it's pretty fun too. Now this game was released on the Game Boy Advance in a slightly different version. Today we were playing the Nintendo GameCube version, which I believe is the same as the PS2 and has a different box art. I don't know why the box art's different. There may be some other changes, but as far as I know it's the same. The Game Boy Advance version actually came packaged with a Hot Wheels style race car toy based on the race car from the game and movie.
Gentlemen, start your engines.
The game Driven is a movie game, but it's also a very basic racing game. It doesn't offer very much to the racing game genre, and kind of sticks to its basics overall. So when I'm used to playing games like Gran Turismo or Project Gotham Racing, this game is definitely a little bit lackluster, but it does play alright. The gameplay is all there, the controls are good, it's fun to play. The game Driven's only downside is that it's lacking in content, and lacking in anything new that makes it stand out for other racing game. And aside from being based upon a Sylvester Stallone movie, the game Driven is not something I would check out normally. So the game definitely has all those basic racing game options. There's an arcade mode, a story mode, which we'll get into later. In the game's arcade mode, there are championship cups, quick play races, and training races, as well as the option to play the game in multiplayer races on split screen. We're focusing mainly on story mode here. This game's graphics might be a little different than you expect. The movie was not computer animated or a cartoon, it was live action. However, in the video game it uses 3D visuals, or cel-shaded style, two-dimensional-ish, cartoonish depictions of the characters, including Stallone, all the characters from the movie, the announcers for the races, and so on. Even the cars and some of the backgrounds and things like load screens and menus have that same 2D, cel-shaded-ish, cartoonish art style. About the game's story mode, you go level after level, race after race throughout the game's story, which is based upon the movie's story with some extended story sequences. You play as the character Jimmy Bly, a hotshot, up-and-coming new racer who wants to be the champ. He is trained by veteran racer Joe Tonto, who is Stallone's character. Joe Tonto was an expert racer who, at some point in his career, lost everything. It ruined his life. He lost his wife, he lost his career as a racer.
And I lost the edge, lost my wife, lost the championship. I lost it all.
In the comeback story of Driven, Joe Tonto is trying to train Jimmy Bly to become the best racer he can be. And while for this review I didn't have time to complete the entire game's story mode, what I did play was interesting enough to keep me going, and there's not too many racing games that have a decent story mode. So if you like the movie, you like the story and characters in the movie, this video game actually has some good stuff going for it on the story mode. While the gameplay and the basics of the game are limited and kind of lacking compared to the big racing games that we know, the story is actually very good. And Driven might be the most obscure game that I have on this list because it's a racing game, has Stallone in it. It is advertised in the back that Stallone does the voice work in this game, but for the most part it seems like one of the more obscure games on this list. I had to dig a little bit deeper to find this one. Now we're moving on to my personal favorite Sylvester Stallone movie franchise and character, and that is Rocky. We've got Rocky for the GameCube and the PS2 here today. These games are almost identical. There's some slight differences which I'll point out, so it won't be as much of a comparison as with the Judge Dredd games. We'll mostly focus on the GameCube version here today. But this is a really great boxing game. It holds up with other boxing games, not just movie games. It features many different characters from the first 5 Rocky movies and follows the storyline pretty well. It's a lot of fun. And while I have today's game on the PS2 and the GameCube, we're mainly playing it on the GameCube today for 2 main reasons. One is the controller. I prefer the GameCube controller for this type of video game. And the second is the graphics. The graphics are nearly the same, but the GameCube version runs in 480p, while the PS2 is limited to 480i resolutions, which not only makes it harder to record, it also makes it looking a little bit worse than Nintendo's version. Now this game, Rocky, is probably the greatest game on this list. Not only was this the first Stallone-based game that I played, and the first Rocky video game that I played, it's also one that I completed fully because it was a lot of fun to play, and it also inspired me to get all these games and to make this video. So what is the game Rocky about? Rocky is a 3D boxing game based upon the first 5 Rocky movies, which were the only ones that were out at the time. It has a story mode which centers solely around the character Rocky Balboa, Stallone's character from the movie. It goes through each of the 5 movies in chronological order, so 1 through 5. The game's story chronicles the way that Rocky changes and grows as a boxer, and his character changes, who he meets and interacts with and fights against in the ring. Fans of the Rocky series and newcomers alike will get to experience Rocky's story purely in the boxing form of it. So you miss out on a lot of the character interaction, the drama, the romance, and other things that go on behind the boxing scenes of the Rocky movies. So while in this game there are interactions from Rocky between Apollo Creed, Clubber Lang, and Ivan Drago, for example, as well as Mighty Mick, Rocky's own trainer, and all the other boxers that he encounters throughout the series, there isn't any background drama or story about Rocky and Adrian, Rocky and Paulie, or any of Rocky's family in the later movies. But back to the gameplay, the game has awesome controls. I think these controls are perfect for a boxing game in a 3D setting. It's not Punch-Out, it's a different perspective and a different gameplay style. It's also not your most realistic sports style boxing game, but it has a nice control scheme that I think adapts well and fits perfectly with the boxing setup. You have the left thumbstick to move your character around, the L button to hold down to block and dodge, you have the R button to hold down to hold with another button to do a stronger attack. The controls are used solely for punches, so you have the right hand and the left hand, which both have their own style of punches. You have a low punch and a high punch with the right hand, as well as a low punch and high punch with the left hand. The game's HUD is very simple to read and understand. You have the round time, each character's stamina or HP if you want to call it that, their health in the match, as well as each character's energy, which depletes as you use more attacks or block for a long amount of time. The boxing matches in this game continue round after round depending on if you run out of time or if one of the characters runs out of health. At the end of each round, you get stats on the screen. It shows how many punches were thrown, how many punches were landed, how many knockdowns occurred, and your points based upon all those stats. The gameplay is fast, strong, and intense, just as any fighting game should be. Graphically, everything holds up. You can recognize each of the characters based upon what they look like in the movie. The backgrounds and settings for each stage look nice and appropriate for what movie they're based upon. And the characters even sweat, bleed, and take physical damage that stays there throughout the match, which only adds to the intensity and makes the fight a little bit more realistic, as you see the true damage on Rocky and his opponents' faces. The game features many characters to play as. Pretty much every character you can think of from the first 5 Rocky movies is included in some form, and most of them are playable. And of course you can bring in a friend for a 2-player versus mode fight as well. The minigames that you use for training are all different, and you get to choose 2 of them in between each boxing match to increase the stats of Rocky and make him stronger or faster, more stamina, determination, or movement. Depending on how good you do during these minigames, you get more and more stats or even less stats if you do bad. Now, some of these minigames I found very easy and I could do them very well. Some of them I didn't quite understand. So there's a good thing about this in the game. You can actually do an auto train for specific minigames. So if I find one that I'm stuck at or I just don't understand the gameplay of that minigame, but I still want to raise that stat, I can choose Auto Train. It gives you an automatic 5 points in that series. And while the game's story does feature all the main fights from the first 5 movies, it does have some filler in between with minor boxers, which is cool and makes sense. If you watch the movies, there are fights aside from the main characters. And it makes sense to play through those to see Rocky's training progress over a longer period of time, instead of just fighting the main characters like Apollo Creed or Ivan Drago, for example. Another cool thing that you can do in the game is you can change the camera options. I know that sounds really basic, but you start out on a side-by-side fighting match. I changed it so you can see the camera from behind Rocky's back at all times. For some reason this helped me out. It kind of gave it more of a Punch-Out style as well, which I thought was kind of cool. That's it for this Rocky game. This is definitely the best game on this list of games. There's a lot of great games on this list. I'm not saying anything's really bad. Now that Rocky game, which was also on the Xbox, also received a handheld version for the Game Boy Advance, so we'll be checking that one out as well for our only handheld game on this video. Rocky for the GBA features similar gameplay but in a 2-dimensional style, as also has a similar presentation to the GameCube, PS2, Xbox versions of the same game, Rocky, and is based upon the first 5 Rocky films. The It's a boxing game, 2D style for the GBA. Yes, a handheld Rocky game. This one's also called Rocky. It's a little bit different than those. So with the game Rocky, it's based upon the first 5 Rocky films. You follow the story from each movie one after the other until you complete all 5 movies, and you see the entire story of Rocky. Play as Rocky Balboa and other boxers going through the story of Rocky 1 through 5. And as you go through the story, there are cutscenes depicting the story actions, as well as levels where you go and box the other fighters. The game Rocky is purely a boxing game. You have boxing tournaments and boxing matches, as well as some training mode sequences where you can build up the strength of the character Rocky. Now this version of Rocky on the Game Boy Advance features movie mode as its main mode, which is the story mode of the game. There's also an exhibition mode where you can do quick play matches against different boxers. Depending on which ones you have unlocked, you can play as those characters as well. There's an unlockable knockout mode in the game, which I haven't tried out yet. There's also a versus 2-player mode if you have a Game Boy Advance Game Link cable and you and your friend both have the game and a Game Boy Advance. Graphically, the game holds up pretty well. It's a 2-dimensional game, so that's kind of nice to check out as I'm a retro game channel. It's nice to see something that might have been possible on the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis that never was released. So this Rocky game does have that Super Nintendo or Genesis gameplay style as well. While the Game Boy Advance only had 2 buttons, A and B, plus an L and R button on the top, and a nice D-pad, you can tell that the gameplay is going to be a little bit more limited and different than the home console versions. But basic boxing gameplay is still intact. You have 2 types of punches at least, as well as the ability to dodge and move around the ring. It's interesting that the game is not 3D, it's 2D, but when you move around, the background kind of emulates that 3D style. So it looks pretty good for a 2D game. The graphics are really nice, and they hold up, and they kind of give you a sense of the game being larger than it actually is. It's also worth pointing out that the graphics are not tiny little sprites like a Double Dragon type of sprite. They are big and zoomed in, so you never really see the boxer's legs. It's mostly the upper torso. You see the fight up close and personal. The game features many of the same or similar training mode minigames from the console versions. So for the most part, this game is a little bit limited, a little bit scaled down from the console versions, but it still holds up well enough to be a great Rocky experience on the Game Boy Advance. If you're looking for a portable Rocky game, this is your go-to game. That Rocky game was so good that they followed it up for a game exclusively to the PS2 and the Xbox. We have it here on the Xbox today, Rocky Legends. Rocky Legends features prequel stories, not featured in the films, about many of the Rocky characters, the iconic ones, Ivan Drago, Apollo Creed, Rocky Balboa, and so on. And all these characters have prequel stories in Rocky Legends, plus they have the same type of boxing gameplay and mechanics that you know from the previous Rocky game. We'll check this out right now. So now this game, Rocky Legends, plays very similarly, and I'm pretty sure it's based on the same game engine and style from the previous game. The reason this game is titled Rocky Legends is because it features prequels for all the main Rocky characters, such as Apollo Creed, Rocky Balboa, Ivan Drago, Clubber Lang, and so on. So in this game's story mode, to keep it separate and different from the previous Rocky game, which featured the stories of Rocky 1 through 5, this one features prequel stories featuring unseen content from the movies, so things that you don't know about these characters will be revealed to you in this video game's story mode. While the game has a very similar graphic and art style to the previous Rocky game, I think they did update the character models a little bit, and there may be a few new fighters. In some of the cutscenes for this game, they incorporated a use of mixed film footage in with the game footage. So at times you're seeing clips from one of the first 5 Rocky movies, and at times you're seeing in-game graphics. And currently I'm not sure when the game crosses over to the actual Rocky movies story, because most of those stories were already covered in the previous Rocky game, and this is basically the same style and basically the same game as the previous one. While this is on Xbox, not Nintendo GameCube, the controls are pretty much the same for that controller style. And the gameplay is pretty much the same as well. You have the same system of 2 punches, 1 for each hand. You have the block and the stronger attacks, you have the moving around. The HUD is basically the same as well. You have a timer, you have rounds, you have your health. One cool new feature on the HUD is it actually indicates when you get a combo attack. And while it seems like a more advanced graphics style element that they added into this one that was not in the last one, that is motion blur and slowdown. So when you view a replay of the game match, it actually plays it with some motion blur and some slowdown effects. There might be a little bit of motion blur in the main gameplay graphics as well, which to some people they might like that. For me, motion blur is very distracting and a little disorienting, so I don't really like that they added that. Very picky thing, but it's one of the only few differences I can point out about this game compared to the previous one. While I think that Rocky is better than Rocky Legends just in a basic sense because Rocky covers the main 5 movies, focuses more on Rocky Balboa, while this one is a side story, a prequel as well, for many of the characters. So Rocky Legends' story is pretty cool because you get to learn more about the characters that you know from the movie and see new content, new story. But on the other hand, it's not the story that you know and love from the movies, so in that way, I kind of like the first Rocky game better than this one. The changes that they made between the two games are very minor, and so far I haven't really found too much of a difference in terms of gameplay. It seems to be based on the same engine once again, and a lot of the gameplay and controls are very much the same. The money that's awarded to you at the end of each match depends on what you did during each match. If you made things like comebacks or combos, you get more money awarded to you, which I think is pretty cool. While this game features clips from the movies more so than the last game, it does also feature pre-rendered cutscenes that are using in-game graphics to detail the story of these characters. And while I said that the Rocky game for PS2, GameCube, and Xbox that we did previously was the best game on this list, this might be the second best game on this list just because it's pretty much the same gameplay, a little bit different in design, but they're both pretty much the same thing overall. And that's it for our Rocky games. Rocky on the Game Boy Advance, Rocky for the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, and Rocky Legends for the Xbox and PS2. These games are awesome, and I highly recommend these in any Stallone fans or Rocky fans video game library. And that's all the video games I have today in this video. Yo Adrian, I did it! Alright everybody, that was it for today's video on Happy Beard Games. We checked out some Sylvester Stallone movie-based video games for various consoles. Over 10 different video games were featured in this video. A lot of stuff. Most of them are pretty positive reviews. I actually like a lot of these games, and I had a lot of fun doing this. I was highly surprised that a lot of these games were not generic tie-ins to movies that were cheaply made. A lot of them were very good. Even with some differences on console to console, like Sega Genesis versus Super Nintendo, they still hold up both very well on games that are on both consoles. So they did a really great job with a lot of these games, and I think with the games that I showed today, at least they featured and showed some true respect to Sylvester Stallone's work in his movies by creating great video games to go alongside them. Alright everybody, thanks for watching Happy Beard Games once again. Remember, you can check me out on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter as well. Stay tuned for more classic gaming goodness. Alright everybody, thanks for watching. Bye!